Good morning, good afternoon, good day to you. Welcome to those who have been able to make it to our webinar live. My name is Carmen John, and again, we have a webinar brought to you by our president of Applied Integration, Don Cockane, on backups. Don has a little over 30 years in the IT industry, so he has a vast knowledge of how backups work and the necessity of them within your business. So without further ado, I pass on to the president, Don Cockane.
Thanks, Carmen. Just checking, can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep, all right, good, let's get rolling. Thanks for joining me today, folks. We'll keep everyone muted. We do have quite a bit of stuff to get through today. So I'm just gonna tear into this topic. It's a big one and we've got a lot of stuff to cover. And then what we'll do is if you have any questions, if you'll type them into the little questions box on the side of your control panel there for the webinar, then Carmen and Jennifer will be watching those and we'll try to get to those at the end if we have time. And if we don't catch everybody's questions at the end of the webinar, we'll certainly reach out to you directly by email or whatever and answer your questions. So let's just jump right into this. This is a big topic and we like to kind of make sure that everybody really has a handle on backups. And so what I'm going to talk about today in this webinar is kind of three major aspects of this. The first is we're going to talk about the methodology that you're using to do your backups, because technology's changed quite a bit in the last little bit. And we have found that sometimes when we're in talking to a new business, looking at their IT infrastructure and so forth, that some old stuff's still being done. So we're going to kind of go through some of that, make sure you're up to speed on what the latest and greatest way to do backups is. And we're going to talk about disaster recovery and business continuity. And those are two kind of separated topics, but also tied together so that, you know, the whole idea is we want to keep you running when bad things happen. So, so let's just jump in here. The most important backup considerations is what I like to start with. So obviously, if we're going to try to set our business up to be protected when something goes south on us, we've got to start before that happens. So we've got to sit down on a day like today when nothing bad is happening, and we've got to start to think about and do some planning around our backup and disaster recoveries so that we're prepared when things happen. Because when the bad incident is going on is not the time to be wondering if you've got the right methodology in place, the right technology, you've planned everything out properly and so forth. So the idea is, again, while things are calm, we want to start thinking about what you're doing in terms of backup. And what we do here at Applied Integration is we do IT services for business and only for businesses. And so I spend a lot of time talking to business owners and principals of the companies. And generally speaking, when the conversation gets around to backup, most folks have a concept of backup and they know it's important. They've had computers in their business for a long time and they know that they're doing some sort of a backup. But when we really start to kind of pull the covers back and drill into this topic a little bit about, are you backing up everything that's important to your business? I sometimes find that people, discover through this process that they're really not covering everything with some form of a backup plan. And I'll explain what I mean. So in most businesses, you've got your primary line of business application or applications. And it might be, if we do a lot of work with lumber yards, it's their what we call their point of sale system, or it might be your QuickBooks, or it might be your whatever application you use to do your manufacturing or your design tools. And in most cases, that bulk system that has the most of the business activity being done in it is being backed up in some form or fashion. And normally the business owners or the business principals, when I ask them, are you backing everything up? They'll go, yes, I know exactly how my ERP system is being backed up. But what I like to do then is probe a little bit deeper and say, okay, so we know that the big stuff is backed up, but what about the other, I'll call it high value data that is laying around in various corners of your network that you may not really think about when you're starting to think about stuff that's going to impact you if it's gone. So whenever I'm talking to the business owner, a lot of times I'll just say flat out, is your PC backed up? And they'll go, well, no, there's nothing really on my PC. I run in the ERP system like everyone else does. But then again, it doesn't take much research to understand that they might have an Excel spreadsheet in there that maybe has the budget for the next year, and they've spent a lot of time working on that budget. In fact, oftentimes I find that budget spreadsheets are the kind of thing that a lot of kind of the higher dollar people in the business, you know, the people on the big payrolls, work together, department heads and managers and so forth, all kind of contribute to the budget spreadsheet. And so there's a lot of valuable company time tied up in getting that document created. And when we look about where is that file, where does it actually sit on the network? Oh, it's sitting on the owner's computer directly, or it's sitting on the bookkeeper's computer or something like that. So it's a high value piece of information. It's a file that's, you know, everybody spent a lot of time on, and it would be difficult to reproduce. And yet it may not be included in the backup plan at all because it's sitting on the bookkeeper's computer directly. And the main backup that's running against the ERP data isn't coming over and getting that file as well. So all I'm saying here is when you start to do your planning about backing up all of your information, you do have to look first at the big stuff, obviously. If you've got a system that 90% of your employees are in 90% of the day, obviously that's the most important part to be covered under the backup plan. But the other thing I do want to make sure is that you don't miss the opportunity to kind of look around and see what other high value information you have that might not cripple your business if you lose it, but it might be pretty costly in terms of lost labor time or lost value. If it's that budget spreadsheet that everybody spent 2 months working on and fine tuning, and then somebody overwrites it with another file at the end, so everybody's got to go back and do that work again. It could be a real nuisance to the business. So all I'm saying here is as we start to think about backups, think big, cast a wide net around your business, and look in all those little corners and crevices and make sure that we're getting everything covered by some aspect of the plan. Now, I mentioned how technology has changed over time. I've been in this business, like Carmen said, over 30 years now, and I come from the days back when everything was backed up to tape, and you know, we had tape cartridges and we had a whole stack of them, and they were labeled Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then month end, and then year end, and so forth. And for the most part, we don't very often run into anyone who's backing up to some form of flexible writable media like tape drives anymore. But every so often we do find someone who's still doing backup to tape. And so I do like to make sure that we touch on this just a little bit to kind of go, you know what, tape backup is dead. I mean, it's not effective. Tapes deteriorate, and if you're still doing backups to tape, your tape cartridges are probably getting pretty long in the tooth by now. And so the odds of being able to successfully get all that information back off of that media, that backup media, is pretty low, and that's just the facts. So if you do have some form of flexible media like that, like tapes or heaven forbid floppy drives or anything like that, the tape cartridges, or sometimes they were called backup cartridges, if you've got anything like that in the mix, you're probably not using the most effective way to do backup now. Disk drives, physical disk drives, have become very inexpensive and have huge capacities now. And so the concept with backup, the device itself is we want to be backing up to a disk or a series of disks put together in an array. And so what we generally have when we're talking about this is you'll have some form of an appliance, like a physical piece of equipment that'll come into the business and sit on a table or a shelf or in your rack or whatever, and it will be the backup appliance, and it will have a whole bunch of hard drives in it. And nowadays they might even be solid state drives where there's no actual spinning platters in there. But they're generally put in this box, and this box is directly connected to your network, and we think of that in terms of, we call it a backup appliance. So if you are not backing up to some form of disk drives, then your backup media is probably going to let you down, or the odds of it letting you down when you need it the most are pretty high. And so I don't like to see anything in the mix anymore that's not writing to hard drives themselves. Now, another thing that we do find is the actual backup software that people are using. Some of it has not aged all that well. And at the time, we started out doing what we called this full and incremental chain backup process. It was the best we had at the time. And so the concept was that typically on a Sunday night when the business was closed, or on Sunday day when you had the whole day, you would back up the full ERP system, the whole entire system. And then what you would do is you would come along Monday night, and because we didn't have as much time Monday because we only had the evening, we didn't have that full day, then we would back up just the changes to the system that had taken place during Monday's business. So we would have one backup that was as the system looked at the end of the day on Sunday, and then we would have another backup that would then show all the changes that happened from Sunday to the end of the day Monday. And then you repeat that process. Tuesday, you back up just the things that had changed since Monday night's backup. So again, at the time that this structure was built, it was the best of breed. It was the only way to do it, and it was fine for the time. But the problem with that is that, well, there was a lot of problems. The first problem was we only had one backup a day running, and so if something happened, the potential existed for you to lose an entire day's worth of business. The other problem with it is if one of the links in the chains gets corrupted or doesn't back up properly, the whole chain is broken, and you have to go back to the last intact link before the break, and that's the most recent backup you can get back to. So what I mean by that is, let's say that Sunday night we do our full backup and everything's just fine with it. And then we come along Monday night and we do our incremental changes, and then we come along Tuesday and we do our incremental changes, and then Wednesday, let's say that Wednesday's incremental backup did not work right, and we don't discover it, and Thursday we do another backup, and now Friday something happens. Well, the way you would restore your systems in that environment is you would go back first of all and you would restore the Sunday backup, and then you'd lay those incremental changes for Monday on top of that, and then Tuesday, and then Wednesday, and then Thursday. But if the Wednesday tape is bad, or if the Wednesday backup didn't go properly, then you could never lay the Thursday incremental changes on there because it only had the changes that happened from Wednesday to Thursday. So any break in the chain, everything after that break is gone essentially, and you have to go back to Tuesday. So we could theoretically restore Sunday, and then we could restore the changes for the end of the day Monday and the end of the day Tuesday, and then we'd be done. And so we could potentially lose all day Wednesday, all day Thursday. You can see the inherent problems with this backup technology. So there's new technology now that breaks this method of doing it, and it relies on some snapshot options and services that are built into the operating systems now of the servers and so forth. But we don't have to do these full and incremental backups. And what we can do now is we can also do backups on a much more frequent method. So we can back up as much as, say, once every hour throughout the day. So if something happens, the potential amount of time that we have to go back to could be as little as an hour. And so that old method of doing it, again, was best of breed when you're doing it. But if that's still the way your backups run, there is a better way of doing it today. Now, when we go back, if we talk about that removable media with those tape cartridges or disc cartridges or whatever, everybody knew the ritual with those is someone had to take the tapes home at night, because if the building were to burn down or get flooded or a tornado wiped it out, we had to have some way of having that data securely in another place. And so some people for years and years would have a tape sitting at their house that was the offsite storage place for the data. Some bigger businesses would drop it into their safety deposit boxes at the bank or something like that. But there was some element of some human being taking a physical device and carrying it out of the building every night. And as long as the person remembered to do that every single day, that was all fine. In fact, I worked with people for years that, they just wouldn't be able to walk out of the building without a tape in their hand because the muscle memory was so ingrained in them that they had to be carrying that tape out with them, that they just, they knew something was wrong if they didn't have that tape. But again, there's a better way to do this now. Back when we were doing that, that was the only physical way to get the media offsite. But today, because the internet has become so robust, and most businesses have big, robust internet connections, we can use the internet to send a copy of our data offsite, and we can store it in a secure data center, even multiple redundant data centers in different parts of the country without making any effort. So if your business is here in Utah, your backup data might be sitting in a data center on the East Coast, which gives us a better chance of your main business and your cloud data not being affected by the same weather event or the same weather catastrophe or whatever. And it's automatic, and it's managed by the hardware and the software. So it's no longer dependent on one of your employees always remembering to do something to get the data offsite. So if, again, any part of your process includes someone having to remember to do something every day to get your data offsite, there's a better way to do it. So as we do these webinars, we like to kind of stop every so often in the middle of the presentation and give you a couple of bullet points, because I know sometimes, we'll touch on something and we just want to make sure that this is one of those things you maybe make some notes about or ask some questions of the folks that are in charge of your stuff, just to make sure that you get good answers. So some of the key questions that we'd like to, again, just talk about for a minute here with backups is, can you identify all your data? So like I said, we know there's the big obvious stuff, but what about everything else? And as you look around and you find that other stuff, is that stuff being backed up in some fashion? And then, are you backing up to some internal device that's on the network, and is it writing to disks so that it's fast and it's redundant? And where we're now talking about moving stuff around in your network, we may have to look at your whole network and make sure that it's up to speed. It can move that data around fast enough so that we can get everything backed up properly in a normal amount of time. Now, this isn't normally a problem. I mean, most networks today have been built out so that the back end, the infrastructure, your cabling and your network connections is all fast enough. But every now and then we do go into a business that's running on older stuff. And it's one thing to put that backup appliance in the business, but if the network can't move the traffic around fast enough to get everything backed up, that may need to be addressed. When we do take that data and we move it off to the cloud, we introduce a few points of security that we have to address. And one of those is, during the transition from inside of your business out to that secure storage place, we have to make sure that your data is encrypted while it's being transmitted, so that some hacker can't sit out there on the outside of your internet connection and just capture every packet that's leaving your business and find unencrypted data in that mix that is your backed up data. So it's important to just understand that if you are going to the cloud, you need to know, is your stuff secure while it's being processed offsite? And then once it gets offsite, is it also properly secured? Most cloud backup providers do a good job of this, but there are a few out there that don't. And so these are the questions that need to be asked, because you may have chosen your cloud backup provider on price only and may discover that, well, it's not secure when it's sitting out in their cloud, because it costs more money to do things the right way, and they may have cut some corners to be offering a lower cost service. And then obviously, if you've got big servers and a lot of data, we just need to make sure that we can get information in and out of your network fast enough. If and what this means is your internet connection big enough to handle the load? So generally speaking, it might be okay pushing it out, but once in a while we find that some cloud backup providers don't have a good method for getting a lot of data back if something goes wrong. A quick story: I had a customer. They're not really a customer, but they called me. A business called me, and they had ransomware on their network, and we ran down to try to see if we could help them. And they had terabytes of data, a couple of terabytes of data that had been infected by ransomware. and they were using a backup product that was writing data not to anything inside of their network, and it was all going directly out to a cloud backup provider. And they thought they were in pretty good shape. But once we figured out that they had this ransomware on their systems, then we had to restore terabytes of data. And their backup service provider didn't have any way to put all that data on a drive or something and overnight it to them. They basically just said, well, just start downloading it across the internet. And when we looked at how long it was going to take to do that, it was going to be days for those terabytes of data to trickle back into their network. So you have to do two things as you're looking at this. You have to look at the calculation of how much data is in here and how fast can I get it out of the business. But you also have to turn that around and say, if we need this stuff back and we need it in a hurry, can we get it back? Is the method we're using, do they have some mechanism for getting it back to us in short order? So that kind of lets us start with the process of looking at our backups and talking about how we're actually performing the physical backup process. And then now I want to transition into some of the disaster recovery thought processes that we have to use to make sure that when, again, things go bad, we're prepared for those things. And I generally start this conversation about disaster recovery with natural disasters, because that's usually what folks think of when we start to talk about disaster recovery. And, nobody likes to talk about these bad things that can happen, but we do have to, and we have to be realistic about them. And this year has been a pretty big one for fires. And, there's been towns in California that have been literally wiped off the map. And that anytime a small town burns up, there are businesses inside of that side of that town that are also gone. I mean, it's bad enough that it's people's houses and their memories and all that kind of stuff, but it's also the pharmacy and the dentist's office and the doctor's office and the insurance agent, and all of those small businesses that manage that community, maybe their businesses may be essentially wiped off the map. And this is the statistic that is out there for this year to date. We've had over 45,000 wildfires reported, and we've burned 5.5 million acres, 5.7 million acres. It's been pretty big. And, if you listen to the trends of the people who manage this stuff, the expectation is this will continue to be a bigger problem and will continue to kind of grow in seriousness. And so it does need to be something that we realistically look at and say, is there a risk that this could happen to us? And that doesn't even account for the building that just catches on fire because of an electrical short or something like that. In the time that I've been managing businesses, IT systems, I've seen about probably 4 or 5 businesses burn right to the ground, standing all by themselves in a parking lot, with their lot all around them, because of something that happened, and generally it was an electrical short or something caught fire or some greasy rags or whatever. And at the end of that night, the whole building is burnt to the ground. So I've seen this happen, and I've brought businesses through this, and I just know that it can happen, and you need to have it in your considerations as you're thinking about disaster recovery. And it's the same thing with tornadoes. We don't predict where they'll happen. We're not very well, you just don't know when one is going to spin up and come raging down the street. And the time to think about that is the time before it happens. You don't want to be starting to think when the tornado sirens are going off, are we covered? We cover a lot of businesses that are in different areas of the country. And so we take this kind of stuff we look at everything that could potentially go on. We have people in hurricane country, we have a lot of people in the tornado belts. So it is important to look at that stuff and just try to be prepared for what might be coming. It might be a severe winter blizzard. It might be just, who knows, but a lot of stuff on that natural disasters side of things can happen. And we just really have to factor that into our planning. Now, hardware today has gotten much, much better than it was when I first started in this business. When I started in this business, servers used to just suddenly in the middle of the day at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, just crash and die. And that doesn't happen very much anymore. but it's a possibility. So normally when you're thinking about disaster recovery, you do have to look at the big systems and you have to say, okay, well, worst case scenario, what happens if this server suddenly goes up in smoke and there's smoke coming out of the back of it and it's completely dead, or the power supply fails and it's, we're waiting for a new power supply to get here. That system could be completely gone. So those are the big things that can happen, okay? And those are disasters, but I talked a little bit earlier about that that budget spreadsheet. What's really more common that impacts businesses in terms of a disaster, maybe on a smaller scale, is when data gets deleted accidentally through, a mistake that a person makes, or somebody does something with, imports a bunch of data inaccurately into the ERP system and overwrites a bunch of existing data, or, there's all kinds of human error things that should be factored into our disaster recovery plan. What if something like that happens? Have we thought about it? And do we have some remedy for it? This is a big one, viruses. So we do other webinars. One of the ones we do is on cybersecurity, and I'm gonna throw a slide up here for you in just a second of some current statistics. But unless you've been living under a rock, you probably have heard all the headlines about what's been going on with ransomware. We've had, that East Coast pipeline shut down because of ransomware. We've had major meat packing plants. There's grain and farm processing company is one of the most recent ones. There's been lots of hospitals that have had ransomware infections. And we are now at a point where we have to think of this as a disaster that we may need to recover the business from. When ransomware gets in, you have to think about this as an extensive loss of data. It's gone. It's been encrypted by bad guys, and they're holding it hostage. And the reason that we take this so seriously is these are the statistics that we have from a vendor that we work with that tracks this stuff in real time from their firewalls and their malware and or antivirus products and so forth. And so these are mid-year 2021 statistics I'm throwing up in front of you. This is not something from 3 years ago. This is something as of a few months ago. And you can see that bar on the far right of the screen, ransomware is up 151% from this same time last year. So 304 million ransomware attacks have been recorded across businesses in the United States since this same time last year, or mid-year last year. And that is by far the biggest attack that's coming in. And it is that way because it's profitable for the bad guys and there's very little risk that they're going to get caught, and it's easy to get it into people's networks. And the one thing that I always like to tell people is don't kid yourself that this could only happen to big businesses. This can happen to every size business. So as you're thinking about making sure your systems are properly backed up, and as you're thinking about your disaster recovery plans, your disaster might be that you walk in someday and find that someone clicked on a file that had ransomware in it, and that ransomware spread across your entire network, and every bit of your data is now encrypted, and you're being held hostage by these bad actors. So how do you feel now? We've thrown all that bad news up in front of you of what really can happen. It can be, again, it's a lot of bad stuff that can happen, but again, all we're trying to do is just have a eyes open, honest assessment of what risks really exist in the business world out there. And these are all valid risks. So the idea is, what we want to do is we want to build a plan that gives us some targets that we're shooting for recovering from those kinds of things. So whenever we are talking to somebody, when we go, okay, well, let's say that your ERP system is offline because something happened, the server's got smoke coming out of the back of it, or Billy over there in the corner accidentally deleted a whole bunch of data, or someone clicked on a file and it has ransomware on it. How long will your business survive if we don't have that system up and running? And that's a tough conversation to have sometimes. And oftentimes what I find is people's first answer to that question isn't really all that accurate. It normally comes from kind of a gut feel. And I've had people tell me, you know, gosh, we could probably go 2 days without our essential systems running, and we'd be okay. You know, we'd be okay. But then if something does happen and they suddenly realize, oh, wait a second, we didn't think about the fact that we can't take credit cards, you know, even if we were handwriting transactions, we can't process credit cards. Or we didn't think about the fact that without our main system there, we don't even know how to pull up a customer's account when they call in to tell them how much they owe us or something like that. And once people really start to kind of digest this question, then the amount of time that they feel like they can keep the business operational without their essential systems generally starts to shrink pretty quickly. They go from saying something like, oh yeah, we'd probably be okay for a couple of days, down to, you know what, we're not going to be comfortable if we have to go for a couple of hours without our main systems. We'd have to lock up the front door and chase customers away for the rest of the day. So we cannot answer this question for anybody. You have to answer it for yourselves, but you really have to be, you know, kind of honest with yourself, and you have to look at your operations inside of the business and what are people doing and how long could they really go without your stuff. Because when you have a proper answer to that question, then you can now start to lay some value and some dollars to those numbers. And the reason I bring this up is because backup and disaster recovery and business continuity solutions are not free. So if you're going to be doing this properly, you want to understand where you're going to lose money, or where you generate your money, and so you can put some value on your employees' time and some value on the data itself. Because only when you have a realistic way to value this stuff will you have a realistic way to determine if you set the right budget for the costs that come along with having a really robust plan. Nothing ever happens in the business world for free, and backup and disaster recovery is no different. But if you don't know the value of the downtime, if you don't know what what your employees are generating in terms of income for the company on an hourly basis, it's very difficult to say, have you set the right budget amount? You know, you're just guessing otherwise. So I do ask people to kind of spend a little time thinking about this. You look around your business and you say, okay, well, I've got my guy over there sitting at that desk. I kind of expect him to generate this much revenue for the business every month. And so if he can't do his job, I have to consider some portion of that revenue gone. So that's the offset that, you know, some offset to that is what I'd be comfortable spending on my disaster recovery plans. Once we have those costs in place, once we have those systems identified, once we know about how long we think we can run without our important systems, then we can set what's called a recovery time objective. So think of this in terms of, we're doing some planning here. So we're going to plan out what we need. We're going to look at our systems and understand how critical it is that we have those available all the time. We're going to figure out what the cost of the business is if they're not available. And then once we decide, okay, this is really critical, we've got to have it, then we can start to set the amount of time that we're shooting for. The shorter the time, then, you know, the bigger the stack of money you're going to have to spend generally. But again, we got to be realistic here. So if you do say, well, we can't have our major systems be down for more than 2 hours on a normal business day, then that 2-hour window becomes our recovery time objective. And now our plan can be structured such that we can show that we can meet that objective. So this is where your IT service provider, or the people who are responsible for doing your backup, this is where the rubber meets the road with them. Is you've done your homework, you figured out how long you can live without your system, you figured out how much it's worth to you to have that system available. Now you're setting the goal for the folks that are implementing the solution to make sure that they can meet that goal that you've set. So again, let's pause for a second and go through some of these things that we want to remember. So we are going to be building a disaster recovery plan that's realistic to your business. And so when I was throwing out the wildfires and the tornadoes, I know there was probably somebody in the audience who was like, there's never been a tornado where we live. So, okay, that's fine. Don't make recovering from a tornado be item 1 on your disaster recovery plan. But the one thing that is pretty common across almost everybody we've ever worked with is power outages. Sometimes the power goes out routinely in the winter, or it goes out when there's the big windstorms, or if you're in California, the power company shuts it off because they don't want to spark a wildfire. And so power outages might be the primary consideration that we're using to plan the disaster recovery plan that is targeted to your business. So I'm not throwing everything out there saying you need to have a plan for hurricane recovery if you're not in hurricane territory. I am saying you need to think about what's realistic for your business, and that's where we start for your plan, because it's your plan for your business. And we're going to start with the big things, but again, what we're going to say is don't forget the small human error type disasters. That ransomware on your network is really just one click away at any point in time. Somebody could open up an email, click on the attachment, and start the whole ransomware thing inside of your business. And that can happen to any business, no matter big, small, or whatever. So do your homework, identify those resources that everybody needs, and don't forget about things like your ability to process credit cards, or your ability to pull up a customer's account when they're calling in on the phone, even if the building's at a minimal power state or whatever. So think about the big stuff, and then think about what do people really need to continue to operate. And I always ask people to kind of look around the business, and you'll probably find there are some job roles that are more technology dependent than others. So the guys out in the yard or back in the warehouse or whatever, they might be not really all that affected by the systems being down, but your credit manager or your customer service people might be really affected. And so those are those job roles that we kind of need to make sure we know we're taking care of those first in our plan. And again, I am kind of stressing the point that you do have to be able to put a value on this stuff. The lost time, the productivity losses, having to redo things that you lost because the system wasn't backed up properly, lost sales. In a lot of cases, we work with customers who are retail businesses, and if the business is dark, then those customers who needed to come in and buy a widget are probably going to be able to find someone down the road who's not dark and buy that widget down there, and that sale is lost and will never be recaptured. So that could be a real cut and dried lost cost. And in other cases, your damage to your business reputation could be huge. If you're the kind of business that people expect you to be there all the time, and you're not there because your systems are down, you might cause enough damage to your business reputation that you find those customers go start looking to get that service provided elsewhere. And so those are the things you've got to understand. You have to be able to explain those to your service provider and say, this is what I'm trying to avoid, is lost sales, or I'm trying to avoid my business looking like it doesn't have its act together. So how do we do that? And then again, please look at those natural disasters and figure out what's really could happen in your environment. And let's talk about those as they relate to your business. Now, this is a plan I'm talking about. Disaster recovery is a plan that you should actually sit down and write it out and document it. Okay, what do we do if the power goes out? Well, we did some planning and we decided that the power goes out often enough that we're going to install a generator. And so, okay, how do you turn the generator on? How long does it take to swap over to the generator? Does everyone know how to start the generator, or do only certain people? If only certain people can do that, are those people going to be available when the power goes out, or are they stuck at home snowed in because of the blizzard? So it doesn't do any good to just think about this stuff and talk about it in a meeting. You've got to kind of build a document. And then you have to kind of make this a living, breathing document. You have to sit down periodically and review it at least once a year. You should sit down as a group, pull up your disaster recovery plans, look at them and make sure they're still appropriate to your business, and that nothing has changed, and that they're, maybe the only guy who knows how to start the generator doesn't work here anymore. Well, what do you do about that? You got to get that fixed. And then when things happen, can your folks access this plan and know how to respond and how to start working through it. I'll give you an example of a business that I saw that did an excellent job of this. I kind of hold this guy out as one of my, like, this was the perfect scenario. Is this was a customer who had all the mission critical functions in his business, like, and I'll use that example, switching over to the generator. That was one that he was in a business up in Montana, and he said, yep, every winter you can count on the power going out for a day, at least sometimes 3 or 4 times in the winter that will happen. But we decided we're not going to deal with that, so we installed a generator. And he said, then what we did is, so you'd go in his utility closet next to the switches that switched over to the generator, and there was a laminated card up on the wall that had step-by-step, simple, easy to follow directions for starting up the generator and switching over to it, such that a cashier who worked there at the counter could walk back in that room with a flashlight, read that document, do those steps, and bring the business up on the generator. And I just thought that was the perfect way to do the planning and implement the plan, so that the solution to that problem was right there where the problem could be handled. And it was documented in such a fashion that anyone in the business could comfortably start the generator and switch over to it. And so that's how you want to create this plan, so that when you need it, things are going to be hectic. If you do have a natural disaster, if something bad has happened, you don't want to add to the stress of that bad situation by going, does anyone know where the plan is? How do we get to the plan? Whatever. So think about that, talk it through, build some structure around it so that it's got you covered. And then, just break it down into all the chunks that we've talked about here. So talk about what happens if the hardware fails, and you're going to go through each piece of mission critical hardware, and you're going to say, okay, the server A that runs our ERP system, what do we do if that breaks? How do we back it up? How do we run if it's down, etc.? And you're going to do that with pretty much all of your physical stuff. Then you're going to talk about power. You're going to talk about the building becomes uninhabitable because there's a foot of water in it, or whatever may happen in your location. And now, obviously, after going through a pandemic for 1.5 years now, we can all understand that we have maybe some health and safety things that we start to have to factor into our plan. And those are kind of similar to, I kind of think of those as treat the building like no one can come into it. Either it's flooded or it's somebody with COVID came in. So everyone's got to work remote. How do we deal with that? How do we build that into our plan? So that's a new kind of wrinkle that we've all had to come up to speed on, but I kind of lump that in with the same, if I can handle the business, get the business operational if there's a foot of water in it, I can also handle it if people can't come to work because of a pandemic. And the plan doesn't do any good if you don't make sure it works. And so this may or may not be something you need to do. It might be something that you need to do in conjunction with your service providers. But if we've decided that your mission critical ERP system server has some methodology to make it available when smoke's coming out of the back of that physical machine, then someone needs to test the plan, the remedy that we're going to put in place, and make sure it works. So if we said, if the main ERP system crashes, we want to be running again in 2 hours with whatever we've put in place, then at some point in time, you need to schedule a test and test that and make sure it works. So you may test it and go, well, gosh, that didn't work very well. Nobody knew how to virtualize the server, and so it took us 4 hours. So now we need to go back and revisit our plan, maybe do some training, whatever. Maybe we don't have the right solution in place. Same thing with that power generation. Generators don't do any good if nobody knows how to start them. And when we talk about that building being uninhabitable thing, it brings in this whole working remote thing. And if we're going to address this as part of our plan, then we have to say, okay, let's say that all of our sales folks have suddenly been forced to work remotely. What do they need to do their job? Can we get them to all that stuff? And can we do that in a secure fashion so that if some bad guy's looking over their shoulder, they're not going to steal all our intellectual property? Or if somebody's sitting in a Starbucks are we securely connecting them to the network? Or if they're at home using their home computer, is it safe for that to connect up to our systems inside of the building? You know, those are the kind of some of the concerns that we need to address as part of this plan. So what we've talked about so far is back it up, plan for when it's not there, and figure out how long you can be down, okay? But now we can kind of turn to this newer strategy that has only come around in the last few years, and it's what we refer to as business continuity, where we take a whole new kind of approach to this and we say, well, you know what, we can't afford to be down at all. So how do you come up with a plan for me to be in business all the time, doing what we need to do, no matter what you throw at me? If that server has smoke coming out of the back of it, that's fine. Who's going to fix the server? But how do I keep the business running while that server is getting fixed, while that physical piece of equipment is unavailable? And that's what we call this business continuity. So it's really this concept of, instead of just reacting to a bad event and then recovering from it in as short a time as possible, we're trying to identify ways to keep the business going at all times. I mean, when's the last time you were ever in your local grocery store and couldn't check out at the grocery store? Has that happened in recent memory? I mean, no matter what happens, you can always get checked out of the grocery store. You can always get out of the door at Walmart with your transaction complete, because they have plans in place to keep their systems operational no matter what happens. And in the case of a big business like Walmart, you know, they've spent millions of dollars and tons of hours getting that put in place. But in today's environment, the technology to do this has now become available to small businesses. So you don't have to be a Walmart to have your systems available all the time, even though back in the closet where the servers live, your IT guy might be back there with his hair on fire because the server's spitting parts out of the back vent cover and whatever, but up at the front, everything's calm, cool, orderly, and your folks are still processing business with your customers. And that's achievable for nearly any size business these days. So how do we do it? Well, we take all of these kind of things we've talked about, and we come up with a way to work around those incidents without them taking the business down. So again, back in the day, you know, we didn't really have a plan for keeping the businesses down. And so when something happened, we were trying to recover in as fast a time as we could. And we were hoping that the time and the money, the lost productivity, the lost reputational damage, we were hoping that wasn't enough to kill the business. But in many cases, it has been. When there's a lot of statistics out there, and sometimes I hate to throw them around because a lot of them have just been used for kind of sensational reasons. But it is a fact that many small businesses who've had something go wrong in their business, whether it is a major system outage or a huge data breach or ransomware on their systems, many small businesses have not recovered from that, and they've been forced to close their doors and just lock the place up and go out of business. And so with business continuity, what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, okay, we've done our homework, we've planned for all this bad stuff, we've got a solution in place, and we're going to keep the business running no matter what. So if we talk about, let's say, what we've been going through with the pandemic here, we hit the point where unexpectedly, you know, last March or whatever it was, all of a sudden we were forced to scoot all of our people out of the businesses and close up the doors and send them all home. But, you know, the business needed to keep running. So we were able to tap into a lot of technology solutions, virtual private networks and screen sharing applications and VoIP phones where phones could be in someone's house, but it seemed like it was in the business, and video conferencing. By taking all of these technology solutions and bringing them to bear on that problem of us not being able to inhabit our business, we were able to keep businesses running and get through this thing. And for almost everything I've talked about in this webinar so far, the natural disasters, everything I've talked about, there is some method like this where we can identify that thing, spell out what the risk is, and come up with a solution to make that not kill the business. And one of the ways we do that is we do a combination of the appliance we're putting in the building to do backups is different now. It has more capabilities, and we're starting to loop in some of these cloud services. So everybody, a lot of people have been using Office 365 email, for instance. That's a cloud-based email system. So then everybody knows that you can log into your Outlook account on the web from anywhere if you're running Office 365, and all of your email is in the cloud. And you can get to it from wherever you are. So if you're in Starbucks, you can get to it. If you're in your house, you can get to it. If you're in the business, you can get to it. And that's a good example of a cloud service that's been brought to bear on this problem of, where's our stuff? We maybe don't want to keep everything in the building anymore, and if there's a better way to put it out in the cloud. With some of this newer backup technology that I've talked about with these smart appliances that you can put on your network, we have the ability to bring back servers and computers and so forth from inside of that appliance, inside of the building. So if that's the situation where smoke's coming out of a server, we can light it back up. But if you come to work one day and the building is a pile of ashes, we still have to address how are we going to bring the business back. And the idea is by moving stuff off into the cloud where it's appropriate, or even maybe just moving our backups off and storing them out in the cloud. That gives us a really good way to put the business back together while the physical building is being rebuilt. If in most cases where we've been through fires, what we've done is everybody, after a fire, the first day or two, you do figure out a way to get a place for your folks to work. Sometimes we've even seen a tent set up in the parking lot. And inside of the tent is a bunch of folding tables with computers sitting on them. And with today's accessibility to data that's stored out in the cloud, we can actually turn on a copy of the servers that were backed up in the cloud and attach them back into that tent and get people up and running while the builders out there, hammering nails and standing up 2x4s to put your business back together. So again, these are things that are available today, and they're kind of ubiquitous out there in the world. Everybody, a lot of people are using some form of cloud email, for instance, without really even thinking it through. And they just kind of go, yeah, well, email is just there all the time, no matter where I'm at. Well, that's a great thing now, and it's a important component of business continuity. So the whole idea here is we do want to make sure we know what we're dealing with our systems, and we just don't want to let them take any time off at all, period. Full stop. No vacation for our stuff. So this is a big concept. It really is, that's why we take an hour for this webinar, because there's a lot to this. And you'll also notice I haven't said any brand names of anything in this thing. We work with some partners that have specific components that we use at different areas of each one of the things I've talked about here. But I intentionally left them out of this because what I wanted you to understand is the technology has matured, the availability to put things out in the cloud has matured, and by doing a little bit of planning and being realistic about the challenges that your business might face if something goes bad, you can really prepare yourself so that you're not one of those businesses that has to close up their doors when something unexpected happens. So like I said, when we were talking about clear back at the beginning, that backup appliance, just so you know what the technology can do these days, it's really very easy to virtualize a server, which means in the old days, you had a server the ERP system was running on, and it was a physical big iron box, and it was sitting back in the back closet somewhere. And if you shut that box off, nothing was available that was inside of that box. But nowadays, with these new technologies and these new capabilities in our backup equipment, we can actually, if that physical box gets turned off, we can turn on a virtual copy of that server inside of that appliance, put it back on the network, and people can continue to run in literally minutes from the time that smoke started pouring out of the back of the physical server. So just know that this stuff is available, and so this virtualization of servers is really, those of us in the IT community work with it all the time, but it's a little hard to explain to people because we're so used to a computer is a physical thing. You know, you can look under your desk and see your computer there. But what I'm telling you is in today's world, I can turn on a copy of that computer inside of the building, even if someone stole your physical box under your desk. And as long as there's some way to get you on the network, I can get you connected to that, and you can see all your stuff just like you're sitting in front of your computer. Or if it is that big server and it's dead because the power supply died and you've got to wait for a new one to be shipped in, it won't be here till tomorrow, that server can be virtualized and hooked back to the network, and your users can run the ERP system or the applications that were on that server for that period of time. And then when the physical box gets fixed, we just put the data back on it, and you don't miss anything. You don't have to redo anything. And if we take that one step further, if the building gets razed by a wildfire and your building's burnt to the ground, there is a way now to bring your systems up out in the cloud and connect them back to your business so that you can start to figure out, you know, what are you going to do? How are you going to keep the business rolling from that tent in the parking lot? So, you know, these are things that are kind of relatively new, and that's why we like to kind of bring them to people's attention, because it hasn't existed in the past, and it really can make a huge difference in keeping you running when things go bad. So I've used up almost all my time here, and we do try to not go over. I try to make sure everybody can get on with their lunch, but this is meant to spawn some questions, and it's meant to make you do some thinking about how your business could be prepared. And if you don't want to pick any threat to your business other than one, just think about what you're going to do if ransomware gets in, because that seems to be the great equalizer across any business. Any business is a target for that. The guys that are sending out the ransomware stuff don't know if you're big or small. They do once they're in, but you're a target right now, no matter what size of business you are. So if you haven't spent some time thinking about that, and if you haven't done some planning, then I would challenge you to do that, because you might find that the risks to your business are just sitting out there as unaddressed risks. And if you don't do some planning and something does happen, you might be one of those statistics where it puts the business out of business. So I hope I've kind of given you some food for thought here. That was my intent with this, was not to sell any particular brand of device or anything like that, but rather to get you thinking so that if bad things get visited on your business, you're prepared for them. So that's going to wrap us up for today. It doesn't look like we're going to have a ton of time to touch on questions. I don't really see any big ones out there, though, so we'll move along and let you get back to your day. I do want to thank you for attending these. We know that this is a big chunk of time to block out of your day. Hopefully you feel like you've learned something today. And if we have spawned some questions that you're not getting good answers to, you know, we're here to help people answer those questions, or, you know, give you some guidance, or take things over and help you keep your business safe. Our phone number's out there. Feel free to reach out to us. But for now, I'll go ahead and wrap this up. And again, just thank you one last time for your time, and we'll see you next time around in one of our next webinars.